Hi, my name is Taylor Hinton. I'm a master's student at Mercyhurst University, completing my master's in science for secondary education. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for being here and for being willing to view my thesis in an alternative format. I really appreciate you taking the time. These are, uncertain and uneasy times, and I really appreciate people being flexible and still valuing this work. This is a project that's really near and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to share it with folks. And I'm looking forward to your feedback. This is my thesis work under my Master's of Science in Secondary Ed. I'll be talking to you today about how I think trauma-informed care and education programs intersect, and how I think teachers can adopt some of these principles of trauma-informed care to better support their students. And I think there are certain education strategies that will allow them to do that. I'm also going to talk a lot about a summer youth program called Grow Meadville that my friend and I created and directed the last 4 summers. And I think this project is a really great example of that work and how we can use education to heal students who've experienced trauma and really help them thrive as citizens of our community. So yeah, thanks again for being here, and I'm excited to get into this. So just to tell you a little bit more about me and who I am and what this work is, this is a project in a lot of ways that's about healing. And it started as a way that I found a lot of healing in my work as well. I spent 4 years as a garden educator in a couple different places, Boston and back in Pennsylvania. And I found that everyone seemed happier in the garden. When I would take classes out to the garden, sometimes students couldn't even contain their questions. They wanted to be out there all the time. And I always kind of thought to myself, this is what education is supposed to feel like, uncontained excitement. So I taught garden education in a few places, but finally landed in Meadville, Pennsylvania, where I work now. Meadville is kind of a classic rural community in the Rust Belt. We have farming and some industries, some tool and die. But after kind of the industrial fallout, there hasn't been as much employment opportunities. We have pretty high poverty rates and the associated problems that go along with high poverty. So addiction, depression, a lot of mental health issues. So we have a lot of youth in our community who are dealing with those issues as well, dealing with abuse and dealing with being in the foster care system. So some serious suffering, as well as it's a wonderful community in other ways, but there also are issues. My friend and I started a summer youth program in the garden, and I'll talk more about that later on. But we really just found, again, a lot of healing and a lot of our youth, especially youth who we knew were suffering from trauma, were thriving. Especially those high-risk youth, they'd come back every year, sometimes multiple times in a summer, despite the program being the same every time. And they would engage with us in a way that they didn't in the classroom. And I had some of these students both during the school year and in the summer, and they just seemed like different people. So this kind of left us asking, why did these high-risk youth do well in this program? So this presentation is like a story about why I think they succeed. And we'll see if you agree later on. So just so you know going in what some of my goals are, through this presentation, I want folks to understand trauma and trauma-informed frameworks of working and organizational frameworks. I want us to make connections between trauma-informed work and educational strategies that are already in use. I want us to learn some of the activities from Grow Meadville that I think can be incorporated into classrooms. And I want us to maybe be able to answer the question, why would Meadville youth thrive in Grow Meadville? So those are some of my goals. And then to give you a little overview so you know where we're headed, I'm going to start by talking about trauma and some frameworks like the 5 principles of trauma-informed care and the 3 pillars of TIC. We'll talk about the educational strategies and then connect them to those frameworks. And then I'll go through the Grow Meadville program and some activities and specifically connect them to classroom activities. So to start by talking about trauma, it's important to know how widespread and complicated trauma really is. Most people experience trauma in their life, between 55 and 90% of individuals nationally will have experienced trauma, but it has a range of impacts that depend on a lot of factors, including the kinds of trauma people experience and the traits and character of that individual person. Trauma can be acute. It can be like one single event, like a national disaster, a house catching fire, or it can be complex, a long-lasting event like living with abusive parents or an abusive spouse. And it can really impact all aspects of a person, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Children are at particular risk from the impacts of trauma. So we know historically that trauma causes PTSD in adults. We have clear and observable symptoms for PTSD, but children who experience trauma are often go undiagnosed with PTSD. And this is because the effects of PTSD are harder to observe in children because our diagnostics were designed with adults in mind. So trauma can change the entire personality of a child because of how trauma impacts brain development. Trauma causes children to be hyper or hypo-aroused. They're always aware of potential danger. So they're always in this like hyper-aroused looking for danger state. This leaves kids really less able to focus on typical childhood development and childhood activities. And we'll look more about that in a minute. I do want to make a quick note that this is really not the full story on trauma. This is an abridged version. There are many hours of trauma training you could go through to understand much more in depth, like what we're talking about when we talk about trauma and what's going on neurologically. So I'm just doing a really abbreviated version for my purposes. So again, we're not covering everything, but I do think this graphic is really helpful. It shows that people who have experienced developmental trauma, like children, have been pushed into fight or flight survival mode for extended periods of time. And that's now how human brains are adapted to live. So you can see in this image, you can see typical development, where cognition is a major part of what the human brain is doing and survival is a smaller part. That's because of how we've adapted to our environment. And then if you look at the developmental trauma impacts, cognition is much smaller and they're focused instead on survival. So the reptilian part of our brain is important for survival, but it causes damage when we're always in that mode. Nadine Burke-Harris is a well-known physician in the field of trauma. She has a great TED Talk that I suggest if you want more information on trauma, but she says something along the lines of like, cortisol is great when you encounter a bear in the woods and you need to react and you go into fight or flight. But what happens when the bear is your dad coming home every night after work? So thinking specifically about working with kids, I think this graphic really helps us to see how children who experience trauma see the world differently and how they have a significantly reduced ability to develop cognitively, which is what the primary focus of education is to develop. Because of how widespread trauma and its effects are, a lot of organizations are adopting trauma-informed care policies. There are a few different frameworks for trauma-informed care that we'll get into, but essentially it's a paradigm shift from an organization asking what's wrong with a person, a really diagnostic way of looking at things, to what happened to this person, so more understanding the whole person. It also recognizes that most people encountered by an organization will have experienced trauma because of how pervasive it is, and are aware that trauma has the potential to impact all parts of an individual's life, depending on the trauma and that person's experience. In particular, trauma-informed care seeks to avoid re-traumatization. Especially in the medical field, many policies and procedures can be very invasive. Without TIC in place, those procedures have the potential to re-traumatize an individual. For example, if you're thinking of a sexual assault survivor who has experienced trauma, any kind of physical exam is going to require intensive trauma-informed care because of that individual's past. So TIC has to happen at all levels of an organization, from management to custodial to administrative, or else trust can't be built and you really don't have a trauma-informed care organization. We're going to take a look at two different frameworks for trauma-informed care. The first are the 5 principles of trauma-informed care, which were developed from the work of Harris and Fallett. And I think kind of the bottom line with these principles, we'll go through each, but they really kind of flip the narrative from an organization thinking about like, what do we need from individuals? to thinking about the experience of the individual and how they're going to feel and move through an organization. So I think understanding that it's really a flipping of that narrative is really helpful. But when we're thinking about safety, we just want people to feel physically and emotionally safe. And we can do that with simple things like signage that's welcoming and clear and shows people, where they need to go and when, really help to make people feel safe. Choice is, where we're giving people a clear understanding of their options when working with an organization, and what they can and cannot do. Collaboration is where we really make an individual feel like we're working with them, asking questions like, what do you need? Planning together. I think a lot about like my own experience in the medical community and having like annual checkups. It's not often that people ask, what do you need? It's more of like they ask symptoms and then try to diagnose a problem. But sometimes it's just as valid to hear from that individual what they need. Because in addition to building on collaboration, that also builds in safety, and makes people feel like they have a choice if they're being asked what they need. And all these kind of build on each other, which you'll see as we go. For trustworthiness, you really want clear and consistent messaging. If one person in an organization says one thing and someone else says something kind of contradictory, it hurts your ability to build that trust with people you're working with, and also maintaining respectful and professional boundaries. And finally, with empowerment, we want our individuals working with an organization to feel affirmed, and like they do have a say, and that what they feel is valid. Again, I think about the medical community when I've had checkups. I know I've certainly gone into appointments at times and said, here's what I feel is going on. And again, even though I'm not a doctor, I think it's valid for an individual to want to feel like their voice matters. And I think that's important in all organizations. And again, these build on each other. So the more you do one, the more you can build the others. The second framework we'll look at are the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care. This was developed by Bath, and the SAMHSA organization also uses these 3 pillars a lot in their work. But when Bath developed these 3 pillars, he was really thinking about like, what can just anyone do to support someone who's experienced trauma? What can any organization? They don't have to be clinical. They don't have to be thinking about therapies or treatment programs. They can just be like supporting someone. So what he developed thinking in that context is safety is one of the pillars. So there'll be some overlap between these and the 5 principles, because of course they relate. We're all trying to support people who've experienced trauma. So safety is huge. If a person doesn't feel safe, you're not going to be able to work with them in the same kind of trusted environment. Relationship building and connection is the second pillar, and supporting and teaching emotional regulation. And emotional regulation, as you saw earlier, is a big issue for especially children who've experienced trauma. They're in that hyper aroused state where they can't really think through what they're feeling and make, logical decisions. So emotional regulation will get them to a place where they can make those decisions and think kind of more clearly and less in that like fight or flight mode. So just to check in, our first goal was that we would understand trauma and trauma-informed frameworks. So some of the takeaways from what we just talked about: trauma is pervasive and particularly harmful to children. And to avoid re-traumatization and further harm, organizations need to take up a trauma-informed approach to support those individuals. And the frameworks we looked at, there was some overlap, even though they were different frameworks. And I think that overlap is that both really encourage safety and trust, collaboration and building relationships. So individuals working together, not just kind of interacting, but building a relationship. Learning to control emotions and make choices, and really giving an individual and an organization a voice. So now I want to think a little bit about what trauma-informed care looks like in education. So schools are an obvious place to tackle trauma and implement trauma-informed care. Historically, we've used schools as a kind of like site for social services. And this is because services are best administered when it's under an umbrella organization. Kids are at school for 7 hours a day, and it's a lot easier to reach them there than at home. Yet services can really easily overwhelm our underfunded education system. So it's important to consider how we're integrating that work into schools. There's a rise in resources available for trauma-informed schools. I have attended, along with other public school teachers, trauma-informed trainings in Meadville, and it's the focus of a lot of conference talks, and increasingly so, I think. Some teacher training programs are even beginning to combine teaching and social work. I almost enrolled in a Pitt dual degree in teaching and social work. So this is all really helpful, but it also burdens teachers who are already kind of overworked and under-resourced. So I think it's important that we ask the question, do we have to completely create new programs in our schools? Or do we have something that may already support our students? So through Grow Meadville, I really saw how trauma-informed care overlaps with existing educational strategies. I'm going to go through that research now and kind of show you the different activities we use to make that work happen. The educational strategies we're using in Grow Meadville, and that I'm going to talk more about in a second, all have roots in constructivism. Constructivism can be summed up basically as a learner actively constructing their knowledge rather than passively receiving it from their outside environment. This theory really contradicts traditional learning models where knowledge is just transmitted from a more knowledgeable person to another. In constructivism, prior knowledge plays a really important role in our active construction of knowledge. So in this kind of model, students are at the center of their learning, and the teacher is more of a facilitator of their knowledge construction. This means learning is really student-driven and based on the questions they ask. One of the larger goals of constructivism is to develop lifelong learners. It can be difficult to put the theory of constructivism into practice. Some of the educational strategies that have come out of these theoretical roots are things like problem-based learning, looking at case studies, and all kinds of collaborative, cooperative learning. Jigsaw is a fun example where students all research a different concept under an umbrella topic, and then they have to teach each other about it. It's a great example of how much facilitation work a teacher has to do under this model to ensure that students are constructing knowledge in a real way. They have to prepare materials and outlines, facilitate checks for understanding, and kind of intervene when students get lost or confused. So one strategy to come out of constructivism is problem-based learning, and this is a strategy that's a major underpinning of Grow Meadville and the curriculum we use in the program. Problem-based learning says that knowledge generation can happen through solving real-world problems. It mimics the way students will have to operate in the real world outside of school, solving community problems, their own problems. In this strategy, teachers, again, are the facilitators of more self-directed learner. The work done by the teacher is in choosing an appropriate problem to study. It has to be the right size, the right level of understanding for the students, and it has to cover the standards that teachers have to cover in class. So the questions are driven by the problems that students are addressing. The strategy can be particularly effective because it's accessible to students. Unlike an abstract math concept, the topic of the problem may be something that students have experience in dealing with. So this draws students in and gets them really excited to learn. This is known as the activation elaboration hypothesis. It also plays on our natural interest in solving problems and making sense of the world. So in that way, this strategy really draws students in and gets them engaged in their learning. Place-based education is another strategy with constructivist roots, where a lot of our educational structures want to standardize our students to be competitive in a more global world. Place-based education really sees place as the original learning context. So in this educational strategy, you try to take the barriers between school and community down as much as possible. So students are a part of the community and learning in the community, and the community is part of the school. They can learn from local ecosystems, local government and civic projects, community engagement projects, any way where they're taking what they're learning and applying it to things going on in their local community. And garden education is a big part of this learning model as well. Garden education is hyper-local, right? You're taking a small plot of land. Students are learning how to grow their own food, which is really applicable to their lived experiences. They're going to cook with that food and eat it and feed their bodies. So it's, I would say, a very place-based education strategy. So again, to check in with our goals from the beginning, goal 2 is make connections between trauma-informed work and educational strategies. So I told you about educational strategies, but now I want to make those connections. I think constructivist strategies that put youth at the center, so problem-based and place-based learning, do align with trauma-informed care. I'm going to talk you through how I think we do that, but I'm also going to refer back to this when we're talking at the end about activities in Grow Meadville. So what I think is true is that choice, collaboration, and social connection, those kind of pillars and principles, are pretty inherent to both problem-based and place-based learning. Students are going to have to collaborate to solve problems. Students are going to make connections between each other and the community. And they're also going to have more choice than they do normally in curriculum. They're going to be saying, here's how you solve the problem. Here's what we think. So I think all of those feel pretty inherent to these kinds of educational strategies. What I think is key is that we're intentional about some of the other pillars and principles. Safety in particular, I think a teacher has to be really intentional about setting up a safe space and making conversations happen that lead to safety. And we'll talk about activities in Grow Meadville that do that. And then trust and empowerment are things that I think have to come from the way a teacher sets up an activity. You have to either follow through with your project that you're doing or build trust in the community. And then you have to make students feel like their voice matters for empowerment. So I think we'll get into that more later, but those things are really key. Now that we've talked about some of the theory that's underlying Grow Meadville, I want to really get into Grow Meadville, the program. I've talked about it a lot, but I want to give it a face and kind of explain how the program works so that people understand what I'm talking about. So I'm going to give you the story of its creation and kind of give an overview of how the program works. So my friend Lee and I, he's the one with the glasses on in the picture. My friend Lee and I created a summer youth program that combined different youth empowerment models that we both had experienced before working together. So Lee was coming from a community problem solving, kind of community organizing background, and I was coming from a garden education and environmental justice background. Our first summer of the program was really good. The students seemed to love it. They came back, they told us how much they loved it. But we really wanted the curriculum to be a bit more solid and cohesive. It was kind of us piecing together our experiences, and instead we wanted to create something together. So we decided to create a curriculum team of intergenerational folks. We wanted to have the group help us make it more cohesive and a lot more place-based, focused on Meadville. So our curriculum team was made up of 2 youth from the program. One of them is Katie. She's the student that's climbing in the tree. 2 college students, Sarah and Marin, who are also in the pictures there. And then 2 educators from the community, one public school and one from a private school. And then Lee and I, who were the program facilitators. While we were developing curriculum, we met throughout the winter and early spring and worked to develop a program that we thought met our goals of teaching community-based problem solving kind of through the lens of food and agriculture. So we had a lot going on, but we thought we had made a really cohesive curriculum. We wanted to create curriculum through this kind of curriculum team because we really feel that each individual's experience is amplified when we combine it with the experiences of others. That's kind of the theory of the program. So we wanted to bring it into developing the curriculum as well. And working with a multi-generational group not only made our curriculum stronger, but it made our group dynamic a lot more fun. So I feel like we brought our theories of the program into the curriculum development as well. So I think this graphic does a good job of kind of showing the arc of our program. We start kind of at the beginning of the program with knowledge. We're building knowledge about food and food systems in Meadville and just where we live, what Meadville's like, and building knowledge about each other, building relationships. Then we move to the middle where we use those tools to gather data about our community. We meet people in the community and we kind of go on adventures to explore the community. And I think this is really where students build self-efficacy in the program. And then we end by creating a community project proposal that draws on the tools, knowledge, and kind of affirmed senses of places and identity that we developed over the course of the program. So this is where we have synthesis, application, and empowerment all kind of wrapped up in one. It's that project proposal I talked about, and I'll get into that a little bit more, has led to some really amazing things, like a teen lounge, and I'll show you some pictures from that. But I think the whole experience of the program really allows students to walk through a problem-solving model from beginning to end, and that has a lot of value. So I've spent a lot of time telling you that students love this program and telling you that it's a lot of fun and what it looks like. But now I'm going to show you what it looks like. So I told you we start out by building knowledge and relationships. Here are some of our students cooking together. We cook lunch together every day from produce we harvest in the garden. So they spend the morning doing garden work together, again, building relationships and an understanding of how food grows and moves around our community. And we do a lot of team building and a lot of getting to know each other through team building and understanding what it means to work in a group. It's kind of the first part of the program. Once we've built a solid foundation of relationships between each other and an understanding of the topics we're talking about, we move to learning about the community and building student self-efficacy and feeling like they can work in their community and build to make things better. They learn about food systems and what that means in the context of their community. We bring people into the program, people from the community who our teens interview about different problems they experience in Meadville and what they think about Meadville on the whole. And we even move around Meadville. We visit some local farms. This is my friend Garrett's farm, Fat Hawk Farms. We went there, and the students spent a day helping him plant and learning about why he grows food for his community and seeing the connections between that initial knowledge they built about growing food and food systems and how it relates to our specific community in Meadville. In the final piece of the program, our youth take everything they've learned from information about the community and the interviews they've done and what they've learned about each other to synthesize all of that information into a community action plan. So they identify a problem in the community and create an action plan to address it. They work together to create this action plan, and they draw on a lot of their experiences in the program as well as experiences prior to the program. They think about the interviews they did, and even more than just like what people told them, they think about how they can use that different assets in our community that they learned about to solve this problem. So if there's someone who said, I really love working on this project, or I have access to, a farm, they can use that information in their project. And then we end the program by having them present their community action plan to the community. We invite their parents, community stakeholders, particularly those invested in the project they may be developing, and they present. And this is always a really proud moment of the program. You can tell, even though there's a lot of nerves and reluctance to speak, you can tell they're really proud of all they've done. I think one of the most important things we do is we make these projects happen. They're not just something we talk about and then leave to the side. We make sure through grant funding that we have funds available for them to carry out these projects. And they know from the beginning, look, we have funding to do this. Here's how much funding we have. You need to find a project that fits in this scale and can be supported by this funding, and they make it happen. And I think that's kind of the best piece, the empowerment piece of this program, where we're showing teens we are really going to make their projects happen. So one of my favorite projects, and probably the biggest and most impactful, is the Meadville Area Teen Lounge, which has come out of Grow Meadville 2 or 3 years ago. This was one of their community action plans. They identified this problem of, teens don't really have a place to go in Meadville. We have a teen lounge at the YMCA, but you have to pay to be a member. And if you can't pay, you can't go there. So it creates an access problem. So they developed a plan for this teen lounge that would be free and open to any teens in the community. We found a space and spent over a year building and making it a reality. And now it's up and running. It's fully functional. It's got adult allies who manage it, but the teens do most of the work, and it's really become an amazing space. So now that you have a larger sense of how Grow Meadville works and what it looks like, I want to talk about how Grow Meadville uses educational strategies of problem-based learning and place-based education in a trauma-informed way. So from the get-go, we knew we were using problem-based learning in a very specific place, making it place-based education, so focusing on Meadville. But in 2018, we evaluated Grow Meadville as a trauma-informed program. We did this because, again, we saw students, high-risk students in particular, who were really thriving in the program, and we were trying to think about why we might be supporting those students, and trauma-informed work seemed to come to the forefront. So we combined Bath's 3 pillars and integrated other non-clinical trauma research to develop our own coding system. So we created the coding scheme out of the 3 pillars, And during the program, we coded for the 3 pillars to see where they came up most and how they were present. So I'm going to go through specific activities from the program and talk about how those 3 pillars came up. Just to briefly overview what we were looking for in each pillar. For safety, we were looking for feelings of physical and psychological safety, giving them appropriate power and decision-making in the program, and avoiding those punitive responses like yelling or disciplinary action, and redirecting instead. For emotional regulation, we were looking for moments of active listening where youth were reflecting on their own experiences and developing stories about those experiences to articulate feelings that they were having. And for social connection, we were looking for positive relationship development and emotional responses like happiness, trust, collaboration, and overall connection that built their network or connected them to resources in the community. So now we're going to get into the activities. This first activity is called Meadville Places. We do this the afternoon of our first day together, so the students are pretty new to each other. And the enduring understanding we're working towards is for students to realize the appearance of and associations they have with a place impact how they feel about it and about themselves. So it can say a lot about their own identity. Now, if we were all together, which would be ideal, I'd have us walk through this activity. But because we can't do that, I'm going to do my best to describe it to you. So just try to picture this. So in this activity, we create a big yarn circle in a field. And we tell students that we're going to show them images. So we just have pictures printed out. And they're going to stand in the circle based on how they feel. So the innermost part of the circle represents safety. They feel really safe there. And the outer edge of the circle or outside the circle means they feel unsafe there. And we explain to them they need to move silently without any discussion. And after they move, we call in a few people to talk. Now, with each round, we're showing a picture of a place in Meadville. We might show a downtown space, a house in a neighborhood, either like a really, house that looks expensive. We show houses maybe with paint chipping, trailer parks. We show their school. We show the local fair. And so we're just trying to elicit like how these places make them feel. And we get some really interesting responses. We try to call on someone from 2 different places in the circle, someone in the middle and someone on the outside. So we get a sense of like why someone might feel both safe and unsafe here and how places can make different people feel different ways. I just have to say, I think this activity is brilliant, and I'm going to give Lee, my coworker, credit for bringing it into the program. And I think it's one of the best ways we start off the program with caring for students in a trauma-informed way. So first of all, we allow our youth to identify places where they feel safe or not. That gives us as facilitators a lot of insight into their experiences right off the get-go. And it allows us to help them develop safety over time. We had one youth in the program when we were debriefing say, I'm an anxious person, and when I'm in a place with a lot of people, it makes me nervous. Well, that helped us as facilitators later in the program. We had one day, we went on a field trip downtown, and we were in a tiny coffee shop, and there were a lot of us. And I saw this teen in particular pressed against the wall, looking really upset. And I went over to her and just checked in, and we went outside, and we were able to really care for her. And we had a sense of where that was coming from as well. And we didn't have to talk about it. We could just support her. So in addition, it allows the youth to talk about why they do or do not feel safe in a place. And it allows them to really process and kind of identify those emotions. So this youth knew, like, I'm pretty anxious, so crowded places make me nervous. And in addition, it gives other students permission to have those feelings and experiences, maybe share later that they also feel that way. So it does a lot for youth in terms of caring for them in a trauma-informed way. Another important activity we do is called Heard, Seen, and Respected. We do this about halfway into the program when youth are starting to transition into learning about their community. And the enduring understanding we want them to take away is that their voice is very important in identifying solutions to community problems. And not just their voice, but the voice of the people experiencing the problem is important. So we want them to develop that understanding so they can move into their action plan, knowing that they should be talking to the people who have the problem themselves. And we do this by tapping into their own personal experience. So the way we do this activity is we partner youth up and send them into different spaces in the garden and in the center where we're working. And we ask them to share a time that someone made a decision for them, but without them. And as teens, I think they have a lot of these experiences, given that they don't have a lot of control over their own lives at this point. So we have person A share for 5 minutes, and then person B share. And then they get into larger groups. So a pair will join another pair, and they'll kind of talk about what that sharing was like and what they learned, and debrief together. And then we come back together as a group and talk about the takeaways and try to get at that enduring understanding. So how does trauma-informed care play out in this activity? Because we're asking youth to share potentially a very personal story. They don't have to, but often they do. We've built a lot of trust at that point, so they're willing to share. We see them do a lot of emotional regulation, identifying feelings they've had and what it meant to them and how it affected them, and developing social connection between each other as they kind of process these stories and get things off their chest, as one youth said. We also had someone say that if you don't understand someone, you can understand them better by listening. They said this during our debrief at the end. And I think this is so important because it shows that they really are going to take that lesson and use it later in their problem solving and then later in their life. So if there's someone that they don't understand or don't get along with, knowing that they just need to listen to that person is a huge accomplishment, especially in terms of that emotional regulation for students who've experienced trauma. So during Grow Meadville, we end every day with something called a cultural share. So every youth in the program will do one of these. Each day we might have 1 or 2 youth go, but it's an opportunity for them to share something that's important to them uninterrupted for 10 minutes. And we say that a cultural share item is anything that represents their personal story, culture, or family history. We've had people share albums like music, guitar, playing guitar. Someone talked about their hair and what it means to them and who they are. So we've had a lot of different shares that have meant a lot. So the way this works is we create a circle, we sit in a circle, and the facilitators go first to set a tone of really respectful listening and kind of model the activity, because we are asking for them to do a lot here, a lot of intense listening and personal sharing. So we want to model the tone. So during those 10 minutes, we tell them everyone is expected to sit and listen. There may be stretches of silence. It's hard for them to fill 10 minutes at first. Some of them not, but most of them it's difficult. So we say there may be stretches of silence, but we kind of encourage them to embrace that, to not rush to fill it, but just to see what comes up. I will say they hate this, but I think they end up seeing a lot of value in it. Some may not, but that's okay. So after 10 minutes of sharing, we ask the group as a whole, who has so far been silent, to kind of reflect with the question, what did it feel like to listen to other people's stories? So we give them a chance to share what that was like and what they got out of it and kind of debrief as a whole. The cultural share ends up being a hugely important experience for students that I think brings a lot of the 3 pillars into our work. So we give them room to develop their own or make choices about their own needs, bringing in that factor of safety. So we had one youth choose to play her guitar while she was sharing because she said it really made her feel a lot more comfortable. So we see a lot of like decision making around safety. Social connection is built by the youth expressing their shared and often really difficult experiences. We don't ask them to share particularly difficult things. It just ends up happening. I think they have a need to share those things and process them. So we've just given them that space, and that's what comes up during those times. And during our debriefs, when we ask what did it feel like, often we have youth saying, you know, I've had that same experience and it was really hard for me too, and you're not alone. And I think that's really powerful, especially for middle schoolers who don't get that feedback a lot. And finally, emotional regulation is present because they're sharing their own coping mechanisms a lot of times. Again, we're not asking them to go there, but they do on their own. So someone shared that they write stories to make themselves feel better, write in journals. Certain kind of music helps them just like feel better and vent, or that they, have a family member. One student shared a certain album that her grandpa loves, and they would drive around just listening to it and how that really showed her relationship with him. So there's a lot of important sharing and connecting and processing that happens in those 10 minutes. So those were 3 activities I wanted to highlight. I don't have time, to go through our entire curriculum, although I'll share my contact information at the end here. And if you want to reach out and get the entire curriculum, I have that and would love to share it with folks. I also have a how-to guide for how to incorporate it into classroom settings. I'm happy to share those resources. But I want to say that I think our program really works as a whole to build relationships. So I think everything we do between our curriculum and all these other factors build our trauma-informed care program. So the cooking and gardening, students have to work together to complete a task. They share a lot. They struggle together. They laugh, and they share a meal and food that they grew themselves, which is really amazing. The team building is crucial. That picture on the right is one of my favorite moments in Grow Meadville. We were playing an improv game. They had to say the word pterodactyl without showing their teeth. And we were all laughing so hard. I haven't laughed that hard in forever. And it was just, I think that laughter brings us together in a really special way. And then we end every day with journals where the youth, we have a journal prompt, but we also tell them they're welcome to share anything they need to share. So it gives them space to let us know how they're doing, what they might need, and to check in a low stakes kind of way. So we're nearing the end here. I appreciate you all sticking with me. Our third goal was to learn activities from Go Meadville that can be incorporated into the classroom. Again, I have really explicit guides on how to do this, but just to kind of make sure we make those connections between what I was just talking about and a classroom setting, I think the takeaways are that anytime you can, allow students to explicitly identify where they feel safe. Work in some activity that lets them talk about places they really like being and places that maybe they don't, or just ways you can help them feel safe. I think it pays off in the long run to build those relationships. Asking youth to share their stories whenever you can. This allows them to connect with each other, identify feelings they had in those stories or experiences, and kind of process and connect with others about those experiences. And then finally, and a lot of educators do this, but I think it's important to note that journaling whenever you can be a great tool for both evaluation, but also check in emotionally. How are youth doing with an assignment or an activity? Did something make them uncomfortable? It gives them that low stakes setting to share. So I think those are ways we can bring this work into a classroom. And then our final goal was answering the questions, why do youth love Grow Meadville? I have already said a lot, and I could say a lot more about this program and why I think youth feels so excited to do Grow Meadville. But I think instead I'll just end with some youth quotes, youth voices. Both of these students were in our first summer and then stayed with us for the next couple of summers. They even helped us develop curriculum, and they've become really good friends and colleagues as well. Stephanie said after that first summer, I've learned so many things about teamwork and the importance of speaking out. Here I tried things that I probably never would have. And then Katie, who was a participant for a few years, said, not only did we learn about gardening, we became a team. We all became friends. It was a very good experience, and I would do it again. And she did for a few years. But I think, these youth are just summarizing that, like, they felt like a team, they learned together, and they really took risks that they wouldn't expect. And I think that's because we made them feel safe and loved and supported. So hopefully that helps us answer that question and meet our last goal. I certainly was not the only one to work on this project at all. I was just one piece in the puzzle that is Grow Meadville. So I definitely want to make sure I thank some of the people who were involved. I'm sure there's more. The whole Meadville community is really a part of this program. But in particular, Amy Berniston for being my thesis advisor at Mercyhurst. There's a bunch of Allegheny people involved, Allegheny students, as well as a couple of faculty, including Nicole and Lauren, who helped me do this research and the trauma-informed evaluation. Lee, I have to thank endlessly for being my co-director and co-facilitator. We've learned so much together. We've got our curriculum team there. And also, of course, the Meadville youth who have been so brave and fearless in Grow Meadville, and we absolutely couldn't have done it without them. And I love you all endlessly. I'll just end by saying I love this work. I love talking about this work. If you have any thoughts, if you have any insights, things you want to hear more about, or if you want access to the guide I put together on how to bring this into your classroom, or more information on the trauma-informed evaluation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email's there. I love talking about this, and I'd be happy to talk more. And thank you for listening and for being here, and taking the time to view this research. And I hope you all stay safe and healthy.